It's Dave with Taboo Customs. Today we're going to take a look at our kit to repair the upper shock mounts on the Jeep YJs. And the YJs tend to have an issue with these upper shock mounts in the rear in that they will collect moisture and mud and debris in the top, and then they will rust out and create a hole and eventually cause the upper shock mount to actually rust apart and fail. So this kit here, we will cut this upper shock mount off, we'll plate the top and the inside of the frame, and then we'll reinstall a new shock mount. To start the installation, we had to go in and remove some items from the Jeep. So since we're working on the rear part of the Jeep, we removed the fuel tank, we've removed the fuel lines and pulled them to the middle of the body. We have removed this, there's a little bracket that's on top of this, this driver's side shock mount that we've removed. We've also removed the fuel filter and a couple other items from the frame to ensure that we can get in there and grind and cut and weld without an issue. Now the next step here is to go in and remove this shock bracket, which can kind of be difficult. Now for this, we'll use a hard wheel, come in, try to cut these welds here across the top, and we'll have to go in and try to cut the welds on the inside of the bracket as well, and then take a hammer and knock it off. Once that's done, we can go in, grind the top and the inside smooth. One thing I didn't talk about and mention earlier that I should have mentioned is that before you get started, you're going to want to mark the center of your shock here, the center of the bracket on the outside of the frame. That way when we go back in, we relocate this bracket in here, that we get it pretty close to where it needs to be. You do have some leeway being it's a shock, so don't worry too much about it. I also want to cover a little bit more the removal of these because it's not easy. As you can see, I removed the other side and I've cut this side loose now, and you end up really getting covered in rust and debris and everything, and in the end you end up mangling the bracket just trying to get it out, and that's because it is hard to get in there and actually get decent cuts on this. So we did use a hard wheel, and you do have some other options. You could go in there and plasma cut it and plasma cut the top of it off and then take a grinder and clean it up. You know, that is another way, but what we did is we used a hard wheel and we went in there and we tried to cut where we could, cut flush and flat with the frame, but because of all the different items on the inside, like the muffler, and on the driver's side the brake line that you have to watch out for, in a lot of cases we ended up cutting perpendicular to the bracket and trying to cut just on the inside of the weld and then knocking the bracket off. Now once we did get all those cuts in there, we'll show you how we knocked that bracket off. And the first thing, one of the things we wanted to make sure we did get is decent cuts here on the top, pretty much all the way through and flush with the frame. So on both the rear and the front side, we did get pretty good cuts flush with the frame, and now we'll work on knocking it off. So to knock it off, the easiest way we found is a section of pipe which can go right on the back side of the bolt where the shock actually mounts, and then a large hammer. My light's going to fall here, but so as you can see, we knocked the bracket mostly off. However, you can see it kind of held on back here, so we're going to have to go inside, do a little bit more cutting on the inside on the front edge there, and then take that bracket off. Looking at the inside of the frame, you can see how I went in here, had to make multiple cuts in there to get that bracket to where I could knock it off cleanly. Now the inside of this frame, and I know this side is pretty bad already, however, looking at the passenger side, once I remove this bracket, looks pretty much identical to the driver's side, where the only thing that was really up in here was actually just a bunch of rust in there that had filled up the cavity between the bracket and the frame. So like I said, once I get all these cut off, then you can take your hammer and knock this bracket off, and go in there and clean this up with the grinder, which will be a little bit easier to do given that now that bracket is gone, and it's a little bit safer to do, so you don't have to worry too much about trying to get into this brake line or anything here. So in the shock kit, you're going to get 3 different pieces. You're going to get the main plate that will go over the top of the frame and down the inside, and this plate is angled. We'll explain why that's angled when we get under the Jeep. You'll get a new shock mount, an OEM style shock mount, and you'll get a filler plate. Now the reason for this filler plate is that whenever you have these OEM style shock mounts, and this was the problem with the original design, is that whenever it's installed on the frame here, you can see that there's actually a little pocket down inside of that, and that's what collects the mud and the moisture and eventually causes the Jeep to start to rust out here, which eventually ends up affecting the shock mount as well. Now that's the reason why we include this little filler plate. This little filler plate will go inside the shock mount on the top of the frame and fill in that area, that little gap between the shock mount and the frame. Now what you'll have to do when you get these is you're going to want to clean up the edges. We'll take a look at another one here in a second. Before you start cleaning up the edges, you can take a screwdriver or a sharp knife and go in there and scribe the inside of the shock mount so you know where that filler plate lands on the shock mount, and you can clean it up for welding. So here's one that we've already gone and we've cleaned up. We've cleaned up all the edges that we're planning on welding. We've cleaned up a good bit of the paint along the outside and the inside. That way we make sure we do not get any impurities in our weld and cause porosity and other issues with the welding. We've also gone in and cleaned up the inside. Now you really won't be able to weld that filler plate to these outside plates because they're so angled and it's going to be hard to get in there, but if you want, you could try getting a weld in there. What we will do is we'll actually RTV the inside of these to fill those in to make sure we don't get mud and water down in that gap. So we've removed the shock mounts from the frame. We've cleaned up all of the old welds with the grinder, taken all of that off the inside of the frame and the top of the frame, and now we're ready to install our plates. So the first thing we'll do with the plates is we've marked the center line of the plate, so we can go in there, we can roughly get a location for this plate based on the center of the old shock mount. Now we can take and mark the perimeter with some chalk for the plate. We'll mark the top, then we'll have to go underneath, we'll have to mark the inside. When you do this, make sure that the plate covers up all of the old rusted area of the frame, and it should cover it up pretty easily. The shock mount is actually a fair bit narrower than this plate, so you do have some play though if you do need to move this plate a little bit. Now if you have installed our rust repair kit, you'll have a little bit different scenario. This kit will actually butt up against the rust repair plate on the inside, which will actually push it a little bit higher, but you'll still have enough area to be able to weld the shock mount to the top of this without an issue. So as mentioned, I'll explain why this plate is angled. One, it's actually to match up with our front spring hanger rust repair kit. You can see how our kit is angled here, and it's actually angled to meet the spring hanger, the shock hanger that is normally here, so that those will mate up. However, since we've cut that out and you can see our large hole, we have to replace that. So this kit will actually can butt up against that. We'll clean up a little bit of a weld there, and we'll be able to put that pretty close to that so we can tie these two kits in together. The other reason too is you can see that we have to miss this bracket for the rear brake, so this kit comes down and angles in to miss that bracket. It also helps us because typically you can see the area around where the original shock mount was welded is typically pretty decent on the outside of the shock mount. So we do typically have good metal on the outside here, whereas on the inside we won't. Now if your Jeep is rusted out more than this and you have issues with these areas and this kit won't work, you can get a hold of us and we can make you a custom plate that we will make either straight or wider for you. You just have to let us know. So now we want to take a look at how we remove rust in the frame to prepare for welding. The first thing we have to do is you have to remove a lot of the heavy scale, and we'll do that in the whole area that this kit is being installed. For us, we will either take a hammer and you can knock away at the heavy scale, or we have here in the shop a needle scaler which we can run across the entire frame to kind of break up the heavier scale and rust that's on the frame. After that, what we'll do is we'll typically move to a wire wheel, and then we will also wire wheel that whole area that we're going to be installing the kit, paying special attention to the perimeter of the areas that the kit are going to be welded at. After that, we'll usually follow it up with a die grinder or two, depending on the surface. Now we'll obviously go in and we'll use the 2-inch die grinder in areas that we can get the 2-inch die grinder into and get that surface down to bare metal to make sure that we can weld. In areas where there's a corner, like at this body mount here, we'll go in with a different die grinder and grind out that corner with a straight die grinder with a smaller bit. Okay, so we've installed the plate on the inside and the top of the frame now for the shock mount. Now when installing these plates, we leave the plate a little bit underbent. The reason for that is that to make it a little bit easier to install. So what you can do then is you can take this plate, lay it against the top of the frame, make sure it's flush to the top, and you can tack it in place. Then once the top of the plate is tacked in place, you can use a clamp or a pair of R11 vice grips and bring the inside of the plate against the inside of the frame. That way you can make sure that you don't have any gaps between the frame and the plate. Once you have that there, you can tack it and then weld it solid like we've done here. Now we can move on to mounting our new shock mount. So at the shock mount, you can see on the outside of the frame, we marked the old location of the original shock mount. So we want to try to be pretty close to where we were, but you got to remember that we have added a material thickness to the top of the frame. So be aware that you have to have enough clearance between the top of the shock mount and the body to not cause an issue. Now with this, there's a plastic cover still in here, so you can't really see it, but we do have a good ½ inch of clearance. And you can see, because we have installed the rust repair kit on this side of the frame, we end up skewed towards the front of this shock mount plate, which is okay. That's by design, and that's because we're up against that inside plate for the rust repair kit. Now on the other side, you're going to have it to where this shock mount will be more centered on the plate instead of being skewed towards the front. Now before we tack this shock mount on, the important thing that we need to do is we need to put our filler plate in there. So the filler plate will just slide inside the shock mount, and it's pretty tight. That's why we need to do it before we tack this plate on. Slide it in, slide it up against the back of the shock mount, and it should pretty well nest in there pretty tight. So once you have that all in there, you can go in and you can tack this in place, and then you can solid weld along these two seams here. You can solid weld this whole seam and inside of the shock mount, and then of course along the whole inside perimeter of the inside portion of the shock mount. So now we've welded up our new mount completely. On the inside, if you need to, especially if you weld the top side solid first, you may have to put a clamp on here to make sure you bring the inside down to the inside plate to make sure there's no gap in there before you weld it. So on the outside, you can see we've welded solid across both ends of the mount, and then we've gone in, we've welded this area in here solid to the new mount, and then solid to the top plate here. What we're going to do, especially on this bottom side here now, is we're going to go in and we're going to take RTV before we paint it, and we're going to RTV this joint here to keep the water and the mud and the moisture out of those joints and to keep it from filling up that area inside the shock mount. Thanks for watching. Hopefully this helped out with the installation of your kit, or if you were looking to see what our kits cover, this helped you to show what the kit does actually contain and what areas of the Jeep it does cover. If you are looking to purchase a kit, you can visit taboocustoms.com. we'll have our kits available there. Or if you have a question or comment or concern with your kit, please go there and click the contact us button and send us an email and we'll get right back to you. So thanks for watching, and as always, like or subscribe.